Hi there, it's John from Tutor to You. Welcome to the Economics Teachers Staffroom. In each episode we're going to consider a major topic facing economics teachers. We're going to ask our panel of experienced practitioners to give their advice and suggestions. Here we're going to discuss designing an effective Year 12 curriculum. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Helen Gordon. I'm Head of Department at a large sixth form college in Wigan.
Hello, I'm Lisa Newton. I'm Head of Economics at an independent day school and boarding school in London. In addition, I'm a team leader on EdXL and I was leading a team on Paper 2 this year.
So my name's Ruth Tarrant and I'm the subject lead in economics at Tutor to You, where I've been working pretty much full time for nearly 10 years. Over the course of my teaching career, which has spanned about 20 years now, I've taught all of the major awarding bodies, been a senior examiner at a number of them, and taught in a whole different range of educational institutions, from comprehensive schools, sixth form colleges, universities and independent schools.
Hi, I'm George Vlachonikolis. I'm a teacher of economics and have been for about 12 years now. I teach at Headington Rise School, which is an all-girls independent school in Oxford.
What do you assume in the way of prior knowledge or awareness, if anything?
Truthfully, we have a bit of a mantra in the department that we assume absolutely no knowledge for our incoming Year 12s. We think that works best because, honestly, most of the time they don't have any prior knowledge with regards to the economy, or whilst they may have heard about things like interest rates or exchange rates, it's only ever very superficial and not very deep.
Well, like most students starting A-level economics, they haven't taken the GCSE. So we tend to start on the assumption that they know nothing. It's quite democratizing for pupils because they're all in a classroom with pretty much zero knowledge. It also makes it quite easy to pitch those early lessons. I would argue the most important thing to begin with for macroeconomics is ensuring that they develop an awareness of the world around them. So I think in the first instance, getting them familiar with macro targets, current affairs, news stories is really important. From a micro point of view, it really does have to be reasonably technical right away. But again, we discuss via opportunity cost issues like, is it worth going to university? And therefore, we always try and introduce concepts via applied examples. So I think that's probably what we assume is no knowledge, and we then try and tease out the knowledge that they subliminally have through, getting to grips with current affairs.
Okay, so we have had very minimal students that have ever done GCSE economics before. So we assume students know absolutely no economics before they start. But I do have an assumption that students are interested in the news. So normally the first piece of homework we give at the end of the first week is to write about a news story of interest, or to write about an entrepreneur or leader that they know about, and in that way testing their literacy and writing skills. But also, I want to look at the fact that, are they actually watching the news? Do they have some idea about what's happening in the world around them? But we found it's much safer to assume that they have no knowledge of economics and start from the absolute basics.
Personally, I would generally assume very little knowledge, although I guess this might depend on the type of establishment that I'm teaching in. So, for example, if you're in a school that has a sixth form attached, it might be the case that you have the opportunity to engage with younger year groups and perhaps do some initial work with year 11s after they finish GCSEs. But for the most part, I don't know that it's particularly appropriate to assume much knowledge of economics when those young people step into your year 12 classroom. There's actually a really interesting, fairly recent report from Discover Economics on closing the gender gap in economics. And as part of that research, they asked 14-year-olds what they thought economics was about. And there were some really quite significant misconceptions there. So I think because of those misconceptions, I think it might generally be a good idea to assume nothing.
How closely do you keep to the official specification? Why have you chosen this approach?
Well, we keep to the official specification very, very tightly. That doesn't mean that we do everything in the same order, but in terms of what we're teaching and the core content, we have to keep very tightly to the specification because, well, ultimately, that's where the questions come from. And that's the core body of knowledge that my students need to know in order to maximize their future success. Now, would I like to be able to go beyond the specification and do more off-curricular, off-spec content? Yes. And if time permits, I will. But that will really depend on how my students are faring with the specification content as it is. If I think there is time to move on and do something additional, then we will. But if they won't, if they're not, then I will just keep going with the spec content alone.
Okay, so in year 12, it is absolutely the only thing that we teach is what's on the specification. And there are a number of reasons for this, but most importantly, the reason is because the students will only be assessed on what the specification asks them to know. So if we spend time teaching them things which is not on the specification, it is going to confuse them and they might write things in the exam which may not be awarded full marks for.
We stick pretty rigidly to the specification. We do the edXL A level, and frankly, the order of topics in the spec makes sense broadly. We have all the pupils' notes and work on OneNote. So they'll have a OneNote file for every single aspect of the spec. It's really helpful for them. They feel they can tick off a topic as they go along. There's one exception to sticking pretty religiously to the order of the specification. I tend to introduce a little bit of development economics when I'm talking about GDP and measuring economic growth. It's quite easy to think about comparisons across countries, and that enables you to drop in some development economics. I try to think about the syllabus in a holistic way and also try to have a bit of spiral curriculum going on. So when we reach development economics, which is not until year 13, there will be a sort of a memory in their head of having discussed it when discussing economic growth and using GDP as a measure.
In my role now as subject lead in economics at Tutor to You, I've had a lot of time to think about this question in terms of all the support that we give to teachers in this area. And I think what I've come to realise is that gaining the confidence to move away from the precise order of the specification actually takes quite a bit of confidence and some experience. I think it can look quite big, it can look quite daunting. But actually, when you gain a little bit more confidence, you'll realise how many linkages there are between the different topics. So with that in mind, I would generally follow the rough order of the topics laid out in the spec, but actually connect the micro and the macro a bit more explicitly for students and think really quite carefully about prerequisite topics. So for example, I think it's really helpful to have covered demand and supply and elasticity in micro in year 12 before teaching aggregate demand and aggregate supply in macro. I also think you could connect in some competition policy from year 13 in with the supply side policies, which is year 12 macro. I also think it's helpful to take a slightly more global perspective on macroeconomic policies in year 12. The key reason for that is ensuring that you can finish the course material a little bit early. ideally quite early on in springtime in year 13. And that allows a lot of time for exam practice, filling gaps, making sure that knowledge is absolutely there for everything. And as well as helping students to think more synoptically from the start. In general, the rough order is pretty sensible for year 12, but I would think quite carefully about adding in macro connections and bringing forward a slightly more global perspective.
How do you help students to prepare for year 13?
The first thing is we're looking for those skills being developed. So application, analysis and evaluation. And that really starts from September, where we're looking at application and analysis following that PEE paragraph. And then as the course goes on, we then bring in evaluation. And by Christmas, I really want evaluation skills to be developed within the students. We might start this by asking questions in class by, why might that not happen? What's the problem with that approach? So we may ask the questions at first, and then we bring it into written answers after that. The second thing that we do, which is really important for year 13, is really talking about the news. So we have article of the day, we have article of the week, and we try and talk at least about one news story every other lesson in the lessons that we teach. So we're always referring back to a theory through articles that the students are reading. So, for example, we might print an article off from the BBC website and get the students to sit down and then to write around the article what theories the article is referring to, drawing some diagrams around the outside, writing some key terms. So what we're trying to do is getting the students prepared for year 13 is looking at unfamiliar data or data from the theories that they already know and attaching that theory to that data. And that's going to be really important for students in year 13, because when they're reading the data in the exam, to be able to quickly bring out the different theories that the data is referring to.
I don't know if we do anything specific. What is true is that we will always try and finish the year 12 material by Easter or just after Easter, which means most of the summer term, actually, we can start going into year 13 content. And this starts to signpost some of the subject areas that they'll be learning for year 13, so that when they come back in September, they're not completely unfamiliar and they've already got a sense of where it's going. We'll also make sure that we share them into any specific year 13 resources, or if there's a year 13 textbook that we buy for them, that we'll make sure we buy them before the summer so that they can do any pre-reading. Find that actually what the students are doing a lot of during the summer is putting together their UCAS applications. And so I would be encouraging to be working towards that. They should be doing some economic reading, some wider economic reading. They should be thinking about work experience or even internships. So that's where I would encourage their efforts to be.
I think the key thing in year 12 is to really help build strong foundational exam technique skills, particularly the shorter answer questions. So if you follow the Edexcel specification, that might be helping students be really, really solid at Section A questions, quantitative skills, and the 5, 8 and 10 mark questions specifically. For teachers following AQA, I would be really working very hard on solid multiple choice question technique, along with the skills for 2, 4 and 9 mark questions. Regardless of the specification that you teach, I think supporting students with developing strong chains of reasoning is really, really important. Secondly, in a more content-focused way, I think that taking a more global approach to Year 12 macro is really desirable. For example, looking at monetary policy or fiscal policy from the perspective of economies at different stages of development, that there's no need to leave that to Year 13. And in fact, I think it's quite helpful to do that early on so that students become aware of different perspectives. I also think you could bring forward topics such as competition policy, privatisation and nationalisation, which are typically in the Year 13 micro spec, but you can definitely do that in year 12 micro when you're looking at policies to tackle market failure.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that economics is quite spiral. So I quite like to reassure pupils at the end of year 12 that an awful lot of the material they've done already is going to reappear in the year 13 spec. If you think about something like elasticity, that crops up again when you're talking about pricing strategies, when you're discussing oligopolies and monopolistic competition, in the same way that the ADAS model is used continually when you're discussing, something like policies to promote export-led growth, which also might crop up in year 13. So I think reassuring them, first of all, about the holistic and spiral nature of the subject is useful. We also, after the year 12 exam, when we've marked it and gone through it, we've normally got a couple of weeks then, we tend to start year 13 topics. So for example, we will do an introduction to business in year 12 in that last couple of weeks, just to get them into thinking about different types of firms, what sort of strategies firms might employ. They've got a lot of subliminal knowledge about this. So we normally get going on the year 13 micro then. And we also sometimes do a very sort of baby steps introduction to globalization. For example, we might talk about patterns of trade or stories that are in the news. I mean, so we can get quite a gentle introduction to trade and globalization through current affairs. So in other words, we flagged up a couple of the topics that we're going to kick off year 13 with in year 12.
We do spend quite a bit of time on some key topic areas, because I feel that if students really do not understand these key areas, then it makes understanding of year 2 particularly difficult. So these key areas, I always make sure the students really, really understand. And if I have to spend extra time on them, it's fine. Is elasticity. Absolutely key to understanding second year complex economics. The circular flow of income. Again, if students understand the circular flow of income, it makes topics like the financial markets significantly easier to understand. Students also really need to understand the idea of trade and imports and exports. And it's worth spending a little bit more time with that and developing those ideas of the impacts of strong pounds and weak currencies on countries, and obviously government failure. But the other thing that we also do to prepare students for year 13 is we teach in our particular topic area labour markets at the end of microeconomics, and we also teach some development economics at the end of year 1, reducing the amount down that we need to cover in year 2. And then we give them a project on development economics to complete over the summer.
What are the biggest challenges in designing an effective Year 12 curriculum?
Let's start by thinking about what's not a challenge, and that is that I think the content for Year 12 is actually pretty straightforward. So designing the order of topics isn't too tricky. I think, therefore, the biggest challenges are actually those related to student skill development, particularly student quantitative skills and helping them address any gaps. That might be confidence related as well. It can also be supporting stronger writing skills, developing chains of reasoning, writing good paragraphs using good quality English, as well as teaching exam technique and supporting students with developing real world awareness. It might well be the case that you've got students who have got pretty low grades in their maths and English GCSEs. It might be that you have students that have never left the town in which you're based, or maybe just don't have those sorts of conversations at home that could widen their awareness of the real world in a way that would be helpful for their A-level economics. So content, not particularly problematic, but supporting students with those wider skills is the challenge, I think.
In terms of Year 12 curriculum design, I think you need to make sure that you get the start or the starting elements, the starting lessons of your scheme of work as effective as they can be. And that usually means for me, front loading it with lots of fun, lots of enjoyment, lots of enthusiasm, because you want these students to keep coming back. You want them to buy into the subject. And as we said before, I'm going to assume no knowledge. So I've got to take it relatively slowly. I've got to be welcoming. If they don't have any terminology or vocab behind them already, that's okay. We'll go slowly and we'll make sure we bring everybody together, as I say, in some of the most fun lessons possible. So to just give you some examples of that, I've got loads of games based around PPFs. I've got loads of kind of what I might call experimental lessons with regards to demand curves and supply curves, and how do we put together a market demand curve from an individual supply curve. So all of that's kind of very get out of your seat, have a go at the whiteboards, maybe run around and play some games, kind of fun. And then the biggest challenge after that is making sure you finish in time, because there's a whole nother load of stuff to do in year 13. So I will always try to make sure that the year 12 content is finished at Easter or just after Easter, so that we can make a start with the year 13 content actually in year 12.
I think the biggest challenge is that, given it's a subject about which they know almost nothing, it's quite important to deliver quite a lot of concepts and theories early on. So the danger is that this can be technically quite heavy going, even though those early concepts of, opportunity cost, PPFs, etc., are relatively straightforward. I think the journey into macro for year 12 is easier because it can be accessed a lot through applied examples and current affairs. I think with the micro, it's perhaps a bit trickier. So I think the challenge is to try and teach quite a lot of theory in order that they can then answer questions and do some analytical work, but to try and make it engaging and accessible. I tend to think about the early stages of teaching the spec as being rather like a coat hanger is the theory and the coat on top of it is the application. Lots of them have got the coat, and so I like to make sure that they've got the coat, and then we sort of gradually put the coat hanger underneath and build the theory in, but trying to access it through examples.
I think the biggest challenge is ensuring that students are given maximum opportunity to develop the application, analysis and evaluation skills from an early stage. I think what often happens in our subjects is that teachers are so worried about getting through the theory that they plough on with theme 1, and then by the time they start writing answers with students, the students have forgotten the really great skills that they were taught at school. And I think it's important to remember that a vast number of our students go on to do A-levels in maybe maths or physics or chemistry, and they're not necessarily using those application analysis skills that they learnt at school. So we don't want to lose those. There is a huge amount of theory to get through as well. Theme 1 and Theme 2 are significant. And I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is being able to teach the theory and then, use application, use examples in lessons for students to see that theory in action. I think what we've got to do is give the students some time to find things out for themselves and then apply it to in lessons with given case studies. So, for example, you could give a lesson whereby you weren't necessarily explaining what government spending was, but the students had been given some homework to go and research it. And then in lessons, you're looking at some recent data from UK spending. So I think some of the challenges are, developing those skills, not getting too bogged down by the specification of theory that's needed to be given to the students, but also allowing the students the time and opportunity to find out information for themselves and then using your skills to apply it in lessons.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Economics Teachers Staffroom.